Evening. I don't know how many of you have watched The Patriot Act on Netflix, Hassan Minhaj, but after every episode he puts up an extended cut on YouTube, so even those of you who don't have Netflix can watch it. And there was one for our time published yesterday about 10-12 hours ago where there's a segment when somebody from the audience asks him, what would you do to change social media? And then he thinks about it a bit, and then he says two things. He says, one, we should go back to an earlier time when blogging and things were simpler and people were kinder. And then he also says that we should probably get rid of our smartphones and apps and keep social media only for the desktop. He said if people did that, then probably it would be a better place because of the toxicity that is encouraged as a consequence of having everything on our palms or our hands all the time. So I thought that was an interesting take. Of course, I offer no definitive answer contrary to the introduction that was given. The more I study this, the more questions I have. And that was a caveat, so that you just know, if you didn't read it, that was very clearly mentioned in the program note of today. I offer no answers. You will be left frustrated if you came here to think that I am offering you a solution to all that I will present to you. But I was interested in the topic also because it's kind of linked to what I'm studying, and that's kind of why I put this up. When my son was born 13 years ago, and any parent would know this, the first time that they show the ultrasound scan, you don't know what the F you're looking at. You know, the nurse points at the spine, and in my case, various other organs of the male body at the time that were embryonic, quite literally, and we just looked in wonder and amazement and not with a bit of fear, but we couldn't make out what on earth was there in front of us. It was a kind of moving object in black and white. But of course the nurse and the hospital staff know it quite well because they know how to interpret the outlines of what is to come, what is to be, what is actually growing. And I thought that was, from a visual metaphor, an interesting start to some slides that I hope to leave you with in the next hour that I have with you. That in a sense broadly share facets and snapshots and frames of what I have been looking at for the past 2 years, and in my professional life I've been looking at since 2006 at the very least. And in the spirit of kindling some discussion, maybe we can have a conversation in the next hour that we have after my presentation. It is an interesting challenge in a sense, and Yuda would know this, in that those of us who deal with data and are driven by an urge to communicate it, find ourselves often asking the question as to how we can do it. Because data can say many things, and many things that data say about a certain context is erroneous, is wrong, unless you know the context. And so it's very, very dangerous, in a sense, to follow the data without knowing what exactly the data is anchored to, where it's being produced from, and what it is a consequence of. So there's a whole field of data visualization. I try to, or endeavor to, explain what I see in a couple of ways. The visualizations that I will show try to communicate the reams of data that I deal with in several ways. One is through what in English is called murmuration, and some of you may have been fortunate enough to see this. Flocks of birds, shoals of fish. There are three in the laws of physics, there are three laws that apply here. One is that you're attracted to something. Second is you're repelled from something. And third is that you're retained by something. And it's a combination of these three laws that create these extraordinarily beautiful natural phenomena, leaderless, episodic, changing, ephemeral, amorphous, and yet a collective. And this is akin to sometimes what you see when you study at scale the kind of accounts and voices that you find in any one country around any one platform or a combination of platforms at any one given point of time. The other way of looking at it is to look at it or to reflect on it as you would bubbles. when you're having a bath or a shower. And to think of each sphere, each little bubble as a conversational domain, not entirely distinct from another, connected to each other, but somehow separate, again fluid, again changing, again not fixed, again ephemeral, but somehow bound by something, somehow distinct from each other, but also glued to each other. And this is another way to look at conversations on social media. It is akin to what you would see in a way that you would study it if you were to kind of look at it this way. Another way is to look at it like NASA or any other Earth-bound, Earth-looking satellite would look at, say, a river delta. Not exactly sure what this river delta was. I found it on Google. I think it's out of Madagascar. But the streams, the rivulets, the large bodies of water flowing downstream would be akin to the main conversations or discourse on a particular platform, in a particular language, at a particular time. And the point about this is that just as you would Photoshop an image, there are doctors, there are architects, there are people who would present to you this kind of image, but it may not be the true image of what actually the conversations are. It might amplify a certain rivulet or a water body or a stream such that it appears to be very large, but in fact, it is not. So this is another way to look at conversations writ large. All connected somehow, all leading to somewhere, all stemming from some place, interconnected, some larger than others. The topography and the geography determined by the platform or the language or the country or the community or the city or the context or the actor or the institution or the time. And so sometimes conversations on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube or other social media platforms can be looked upon that way. This is just one of many photos out of Hubble. Extraordinarily beautiful. Of course, false spectrum. But this is another way, very, very popular way, of determining and projecting and framing and pushing out ways that you would see certain accounts and certain conversations. The brightest stars could be correlated to certain accounts at a certain point of time that stand out for a certain reason, depending on how you want them to stand out. There are different ways of measuring influence. The darker stars may not be less important in the network, but would be drowned out by the brighter ones. Collectively, they form a galaxy or a universe, a constellation of conversations, if you will. And again, this changes, starlight, star bright, depending on how you choose to focus, the kind of optics that you use, the gaze, where you look at, and how you look at. So these are just ways in which people like us try to communicate what we see, because we deal with so much of data. We deal with it at the scale of Hubble, and we can, what you call, zoom into it to a level of granularity that looks at a particular account at a particular time. And so you can go to the specific to the general. And people like myself have an extraordinary privilege of being able to do that. Frightening, which I'll come to later, but a privilege nevertheless. I used this slide earlier where I tried to, in a Sri Lankan context, because the mistake many make is that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and all the other platforms that you can think of, TikTok included, are the same globally, and it is not the case. All these platforms are invariably shaped and informed and influenced by the context that they are placed in. Facebook in Sri Lanka, in as much as my doctoral research suggests it is, operates largely in Sinhala. It is inward looking. It looks at events inside the country and has an inward gaze, and is largely in Sinhala. In fact, I've talked to academic researchers who seem to believe they know what Facebook is and what Sri Lanka as a consequence is, looking at just the English content on Facebook, and it is farcical because it is dwarfed by the volume, the velocity, the speed, the scale, of content in Sinhala every single day, if not every single minute. Then we have Twitter, which walking on a shoreline or beach is fairly easy to identify in terms of the waves crashing on the shore. It's ephemeral. It gives you a hint in Sri Lanka of what is to come, but it is not substantive in that it always refers back to something on the web or something on Facebook. This is through link analysis. Whenever there is something happening in the country, like a constitutional crisis or an election or something good or something bad, Twitter in large volume always refers back to something that is on Facebook. And there's a big difference between Twitter and Facebook. Other than this, Twitter is largely in English. And it's very, very different in substance and style and tone and timbre and thrust to what Facebook in the main is. Now the two together form, in a sense, the seashore, the beach. The sand would be determined by the tide. And likewise, social media conversations would be determined by context. But Twitter would give a sense of what Facebook would have in terms of substantive debate. And at a certain period of time, it would shape the mindsets around what on Facebook you'll find more around or more to chew on. And a lot of us believe, through something that I talk about later called agenda setting theory, that what is, in a sense, the beach today forms the landmass of tomorrow. And with a geographical metaphor, it is simply to suggest that for a large number of people engaging with social media, their mindsets inexorably are influenced, if not directly changed, as a consequence of what they see and choose to engage with. And that's something that we'll talk about a bit more. So this, in a sense, the sea to soil and the sand and the shore is, in terms of social media, what I study, what my doctoral research is on. And I focus particularly on Facebook and Twitter, but I also go into other platforms as well. And part of the challenge of doing this is captured by what we call complex media ecology. It's bloody difficult to talk about this kind of research because you cannot isolate Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or any one of these social media platforms in our country or in any other context and in a sense talk about how they impact political discourse and how the digital impacts physical and kinetic action without really talking about how they impact each other. Think of the bubbles, think of the rivers, think of the way that they morph and merge and marry into each other. And you get a sense of how content on one platform kind of transverses goes into another platform. And I want to explain this a bit more. I mean, I started writing for the web because of Rohan's son, Indy, who over 15 years ago, close upon 20 I think, started Hattotuwa, which was Sri Lanka's first blog aggregator. And then it was a very, very different time, 15 to 20 years ago. Those of you of a certain age and started blogging there on Blogger or Blogspot, which I don't know whether it exists anymore, and WordPress, would remember that time. There were very few of us. But this was also the time that people like Sivaram were killed. I was doing my master's when he was murdered and found on the side of a paddy field by a very good friend of mine. His body had to be identified by him. And so when, in a sense, I started writing, Sivaram's murder was the reason why. And I started a blog and I started writing. And if you take a look at the back-end statistics of Hattotuwa, which now aggregates about 1,859 blogs in Sinhala, Tamil, and English, at the time it was only English, you see something like a Himalayan or range or the Everest. You see that the heyday of blogging in this country was around 2013, 2014. There was an incredible rise, and then there is almost a terminal decline. And I know this also through Ground News. When Ground News started in 2006, you can go back and find that the conversations were so damn rich on the page, on the site. A lot of the conversations, heated, emotive conversations at the time of the war, when we published certain things that at the time weren't published more broadly, generated so much of conversation on the blog itself. And now, of course, the conversation is by order of magnitude greater, but it's not on the blogosphere. So where is it? It's moved to what is variously called gated gardens, or a web that is now accessed through apps. This didn't exist at the time Indy started Kottu. And it's a very different web as well. If the web at the time of Kottu, when it started and when some of us started writing, was a place that you went to, you typed a URL, and you went to a blog to read about it. You did often also subscribe to it. You literally had to go to a place. Now, what you deal with is a notification tsunami, an incessant alerting of content that comes to you. It's a fundamentally different way of engaging with the web. And the web as we know it, and the web as we think it is also very different, because we're engaging with essentially apps. We're not engaging directly with the web anymore. And I have some proxymetrics around this. So for example, in 2018 on Kottu, around 1,800 to 1,860 blogs. In total, for the entire year, there were 145,000 page views. A page view is somebody who comes and then reads, not a, to get technical, it's not just a hit. So this is a meaningful metric of people who actually consume content. Now, a comparable metric on social media is difficult. However, in my doctoral research, I look at thousands and thousands of pages. Algorithmically, I collect them in an automated fashion. And in 122 days, so the period I'm looking at is from the 1st of August 2019 to the 31st of November 2019, which is a period of 122 days. I don't need to tell you why I looked at that period. It was the presidential election. In just 335 gossip pages, exclusively single, there were 875,410 interactions a day. That is per day, 6 times more than the entirety of Kottu over 2018. It gives you a somewhat of an indication around the volume of content that is being created just around those 335 pages in 122 days. So this is not the entirety of Facebook, not by a long shot. So where are we at? We are at a stage where, in as much as again I can see through my research, where you look at digital content migrating to spaces beyond that which they were produced for or on. So the easy way of explaining this is to think of platform A as Twitter and platform B as Facebook. What is on Twitter ends up on Facebook, goes to YouTube, ends up on a blog, comes back into Twitter, is shared over WhatsApp, inspires a TikTok, goes back to Twitter, maybe goes to Facebook Messenger, ends up on a page, is seen and read by somebody who includes it in a vlog that goes on Vimeo, is then captured in a 30-second slice that goes up on Twitter, and so on and so forth. It migrates amorphous borders. And so, content is always occupying a liminal space. It's always in a process of transition. It's always in a process of being changed or edited or remixed or redone. It's always symbiotic, where one platform informs and influences how another platform's content is shaped and changed and produced and projected and promoted and engaged with. So it's very, very difficult, if not downright impossible, and I would say bordering on the farcical, to think about social media in Sri Lanka as any one platform. Obviously Facebook dominates, but that's not the full story. And another easy way to think about this is oil and water. They never mix. They never mix, however much you try. And social media is somewhat like this, where if you were to look at it from a distance, it appears to be the case that it's one big mess. Everything is kind of in a congealed or coagulated state. But when you examine it in more granular detail, you can see that certain platforms while they inform and influence other platforms, still don't quite mix, so it's quite complicated. It's quite complicated. And this is why we then resort to or rely on something called an agenda setting theory, which Cohen talked about. It's absolutely fascinating. This is 1963. It's way, decades before social media. And it kind of captures the world we're living in today, where social media writ large, in a sense, is not about getting people to think exactly what you want them to think, but you want to get them to think about something, talk about something, focus on something, engage with something. So this is a nuanced argument that in a sense captures very well, in my opinion, the kind of timber and the nature of social media that we have today. But let's get into brass tacks. And this would now be going into some of what I have put out on Twitter over the past 2 years for engagement with the likes of you. And so for those of you who follow my Twitter, these slides may be familiar, but allow me the chance to also explain in a bit more detail than would otherwise be possible just looking at them online. I am fascinated by gossip sites on Facebook. And anybody who thinks, and I will show this, that political framing and political discourse and politics writ large in this country is shaped by politicians or the mainstream media really needs to take a look at gossip pages and what they put out, how they put it out, why they put it out, and the collaborative nature of what they put out. This is the totality, it might not be very clear, of the 400 odd gossip pages that I look at over 2019. And there are a couple of things that stand out. So, in terms of how much of stuff they're putting out, they put out nearly the strong Christians amongst you might be very frightened by this figure, but it's about 666,000, which is devilish, but I don't think foretells the end of the world. But insofar as a number, that's the total number, and gossip has over half that. So in terms of the total number of pages, if you split it between gossip, all of mainstream news pages in Sinhala, all of the mainstream news pages in English, and about a couple of hundred pages I look at memes, gossip occupies a large chunk. And the content that they put out every day around all of these hundreds of pages is not just entertainment and lascivious gossip, it's very, very political in nature, particularly during election campaigns. And this is evident in a sense if you look at the time of the last presidential election, where content, engagement, all goes up. But let's take a look at videos. So here, of the 1.6 billion views around 2019 of videos put out, unsurprisingly, the broadcasters lead by a lot. But then take a look at, if you can see it, how much more gossip videos are looked at over all of the videos on Facebook put out by all of the leading channels broadcasting in English in Sri Lanka. So you might not be able to see the figure there, but gossip pages have 190.18 million engagements or interactions, and news in English has just 23.76. I think these are extraordinary divergences and differences in how people engage with content that is political in this country. And then you have interactions. Again, people seem to interact by order of magnitude much more around gossip pages than they even do around news in Sinhala and certainly news in English. These are astronomical differences. These are not minute statistical nitpicking. So when I say that politics in this country is constructed by actors and agents on Facebook, I mean gossip pages. I don't mean, quite frankly, any other cluster in this country, including those in government. And these are the numbers broken down. I don't want to spend too much of time because the numbers speak for themselves. The sheer volume, the speed at which it is being produced, how compelling it is, what kind of comments they attract, what kind of interactions, including obviously the emotional icons that they interact, that they inspire. And just look at the page likes, the difference in page likes. I mean, nobody comes close. Nobody. And this is a world which is there every day, and it's growing, it's pulsating. It's growing apace. And yet we don't seem to understand or realize how important this is in the construction of our identity and how we see ourselves and others in our society. And there doesn't seem to be any slowing down of growth either. Gossip pages seem to be growing apace, followed by memes. Singular, yes, is growing, but again the point is that English content, English news media content, doesn't seem to be very relevant on Facebook, in as much as my research suggests. So what? Why should we be concerned? So I'm sure that many of you in the audience would have read about polarization, particularly in post-16, but both sides of the Atlantic, frankly, both in terms of what's happening in Europe and the United Kingdom, and certainly what's happening in the United States of America after the election of the incumbent there. But the general doesn't always speak to the local. So when I talk about polarization in our country, in Sri Lanka, I see it in a very specific ways. And one of the things that I see is actually quite fascinating. And I'm glad that we have at least one person from government here, because it's extraordinarily revealing in what the data suggests the kind of interactions are around overtly political content, overtly partisan content. This is part of political content. So one of the things that you see is what you call a filter bubble between and within parties. What is a filter bubble? A filter bubble is like an echo chamber of things that you think are larger than what they are. They are circumscribed by what you like or what you're partial to. So let's take a look at that. These are again tweets that I put out. So in August last year, after an academic conference, Professor Sujit Chowdhury, who is a constitutional theorist, and my friend Asanga Balikara, who heads the Constitutional Center in Edinburgh University, after I presented, they challenged me to kind of come up with an understanding of the polarization on Facebook between political pages. And so I took a look at all of the official pages for the SLPP, and at the time, all of the official pages for the UNP. And I'm not going to go into each of the dots, which are accounts. That's not that important. But what is actually quite stunning and immediately evident is the degree to which followers of one party simply don't see content that is ideologically opposed to them. And if they do see it, it's always in negative frames. Right? It's quite extraordinary. So then you wonder how on earth, at a very basic level, how you can have a civil debate with somebody who, quite frankly, doesn't even remotely understand where you're coming from, leave aside being able to engage with you. What is also interesting is that within, say, the SLPP, there was a far higher proclivity, and I must confess that this is all data before the 16th of November and the incumbent, of the son flagging and framing and pushing and capturing content that was projected and promoted and produced by the father. So Namal's page cluster or constellation and those who followed it would have seen much more of his father's content than they would have ever seen of, at the time, his uncle's content. And I leave it at that. So it isn't as if everybody within a political party also sees all the nuances within that party either. I then went further. So I also, as a consequence of my doctoral research, look at proxy pages, pages that aren't official, that aren't necessarily with the branding and the overt admin stamp of somebody in a political party. And for those of you who are taking snaps of this, I have given the presentation to Nightwatchman and I think they will make it available in the public domain. So don't worry about taking bad snapshots from your mobile. I looked at 140 pages partial to, again, this is in August, so this is even before the nomination of the current incumbent. I looked at 140 plus pages linked to or promoting the current incumbent president, about 180 looking at the former president, and about 30 looking at now. And what is really interesting there is what I said earlier, where within a certain political ideology, or arguably and ostensibly within the same party, you would find key differences. Each of those colors represents a certain partiality or connection with one of the three individuals there. Again, I'm not going to mention who is who. But it seems to be the case that two of the accounts are far more partial to and connected to each other and more voluminous in nature than a third. And I'm not going to say more about that, but it's extraordinarily interesting to see even how within a particular political ideology there are filter bubbles. There are things that happen and are things that are said and things that are projected and framed in ways that not everybody, even of the same political persuasion, would get to know about. So let's talk about YouTube then. Something that a few years ago was written off because of Facebook's astronomical growth, but in Sri Lanka has found, and globally has found, renewed relevance. And a lot of this, I think you would have read in terms of how people refer to it as rabbit holes. There's a lot of work, including in popular media, around how the algorithm of Facebook leads people into extremism. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but there's been a fair bit of work and writing on it. So I was intrigued. How does YouTube content in our country showcase the kind of political divisions that we have? So using Verite researchers' excellent framework of political ownership of media stations, I would unhesitatingly refer you to the work that they did with Reporters Without Borders to create this template that helps us understand the political bias and the ownership structures of the media that we have, both print, online, and electronic. I looked at every single video at the time of publication from 2015 January to May 2019, so about 103,000 videos that have been put up onto YouTube, onto the official channels of these terrestrial broadcasters. And the result is actually quite interesting. So disaggregated by the content, how much of stuff they were putting up, two stations stand out. For whatever reason, they have very early on discovered the power and potential of putting stuff up onto a platform like YouTube, where the technical term is called time shifted, where you can look at content long after broadcast. This is also called the long tail, where you can engage with it, you can refer to it, you can link to it, you can embed it long after. And there are two stations, private stations, that increasingly put out content. And this is, again, it's not very clear perhaps in the projection, but if you take a look at 2018, you can see that Derana is pushing out a lot of content. Green, actually, red is Rupawahini. So you see the state broadcaster, for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure, suddenly waking up probably to the potential of having their content on YouTube. God knows why. Maybe they got somebody intelligent enough to put the damn thing there. But you see that private broadcasters are actually putting stuff up more and more. And these range from obviously the news segments through to teledramas and entertainment. Right? So these channels are becoming more and more populated. And what's interesting is in 2018, if you take a look at the period of October to say December, which was when the constitutional crisis was taking place. If you examine how these pages are, how these channels are interrelated, you see something really interesting. You see that the private TV broadcasters are far more adept, better, professional at linking each other's channels, linking the channels of each station. So you would have, I don't know, so for example, Live at 8, linking to, say, another broadcast segment of the same station. And so these stations are very good at linking each other, linking the station's own channels, each other's, the programming. But what you don't find is a comparable expertise, again, maybe just because they don't have the human resources or the ability to do so, around state media. So state media has 1-2 channels on YouTube at best. They increasingly put stuff up there, but that doesn't resonate with the spectrum of their terrestrial programming. This also has an impact on how people get to grips with political communication and political framing on YouTube. So if you take a look at these accounts, and remember I'm looking at every single video for about 5 years, you see something quite interesting. So I showed you mainstream media, and there are also other individuals who start up YouTube channels that become very popular. Some, like for example Gossip King on YouTube, very popular in 2016, completely dies down by 2017. Others like Gossip Lanka, Pattare, and SL Vlog, you can see during the time of the constitutional crisis, and also up until the time that I finished my data collection, have started increasing their production. So these are the YouTube stars, if you will, people who don't have access to, are not part of, sometimes not even in Sri Lanka, but are now putting out politically relevant content on YouTube, and using YouTube as a platform to inform their viewers and subscribers around politics. There is a lot of commentary around these videos. So this is, for example, comments generated by the mainstream channels, and you can see the growth. This is, each color would be disaggregated by channel, and blue is Derana. So Derana's content, you can see the explosion in the commentary that these videos generate. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. All these comments and commentary and engagement is around some of the content. Obviously, most of it is driven by entertainment, but a lot of it is also news segments and special broadcasts on politics. And then you have the kind of individuals who are also generating a lot of commentary. And by the end of my data collection, this channel called Pattare is generating a lot of commentary. Of course, there's divergences and differences between mainstream and these guys, but you can see that an individual or a small outfit on YouTube is also generating a lot of commentary. A lot of this is actually political. SL Vlog is 100% political, if you've seen The Gentleman, right? And very interesting as well, right? Extremely interesting. So that's generating a lot of engagement. And what is interesting in Sri Lanka is that people are sometimes scared to comment. I'm just back from Kabul in Afghanistan, where it's a very different reason why people like stuff in Afghanistan. That's because of literacy. They don't literally know how to comment. They can't write. So an expression of engagement is a like or a share. In Afghanistan, if you look at the topography or the landscape of social media in that country, Hindari or Pashto. But here in Sri Lanka, you can take a look at likes also as a proxy indicator of partiality towards something. And what is extraordinarily interesting is that likes give an indication, a hint, a signification of what you would be partial to. And likes also grow quite a bit, actually, around mainstream media. And this again is Derana. And the private stations as well. These are some of the numbers. So of around 1.5 billion views, Derana alone generates 929 million. So you're looking at it, this is why it's important, this is why I focus on it. There's a particular political framing of these private TV channels that then dominates engagement with the subscribers on platforms like YouTube. But during political moments like the constitutional crisis, you have people like SL Vlog generating a lot of engagement, almost exponentially increasing their engagement and viewer base because they were able to provide things that the mainstream media did not at the time. And this is really what's interesting. If you take a look at this visualization, I remember the Hubble Space Telescope picture. The red are interconnected. I mean, this is a very high resolution photo. You don't see it with any kind of granularity and detail, which is originally rendered in this small graphic, but it captures in red all of the interconnections of people who have commented on across those 103,000 videos over 5 years around mainstream content. So if one person has commented on, say, Swarnavahini, that those connections are made between that person commenting on other TV channels, YouTube presence. But you can see that there is black in the middle. And they don't really mix. The distinction there, the black are accounts and individuals and users of YouTube who primarily engage with the likes of SL Vlog and the small-time YouTube producers. So again, if you are familiar with YouTube, there's a fundamental difference between the small-time producers like SL Vlog and the kind of politics that is put out by Adler Nehru or Swarnavahini or Maharaja. And so what you see on YouTube is that there is not a polarization, but there's not really a mixing around the people who consume the two types of content. Now what would be interesting, and I didn't do, is to disaggregate the red to see whether people who consume MTV would also be the same ones commenting on Swarnavahini. I didn't do that. I have the data, but I haven't done it. But here I'm trying to present to you the fact that depending on also what kind of content you consume on YouTube, you really aren't really engaging then with a politically inconvenient or ideologically distinct framing on just that platform. And so the other thing that I will come back to later is that if you take a look at the commentary, a lot of it is actually in Sinhala. I mean, it's quite depressing. It's really quite depressing. Even on the most informed of programs, for some reason, we can talk about this, the kind of commentary that it instigates or inspires is disturbing. It's very disturbing. And this is now at scale, and as any YouTuber here knows, the ability for producers to deal with that kind of commentary is the worst on YouTube. You can't really manage those comments in the same manner that you could, that the platforms on like Twitter and Facebook allow you to do. So there's a lot of hate there. Then let's take a look at Twitter, but at an interesting political moment. So last year, because of the Easter Sunday terrorism, the commemoration of the end of the 10 years of after the end of the war was muted. Was muted because we had other things to be concerned about and frightened around. But I looked at Twitter at the time that the commemorations were on, the end of the war, in May, and I looked at a week, and I gathered every single tweet with two hashtags. One was Mulivaikkal, and the other was Victory Day. And between them I had around 6,000 tweets. And again, just looking at Twitter, the differences in discourses without even going into a semantic or a detailed analysis of the tweets is very evident. This is Victory Day. And when you do just a very simple machine analysis of the emoticons used and the words, a word frequency, this is really simple stuff. This is not going into any kind of study. Just keep in mind those emoticons and keep in mind those words, all of which, by the way, are in Sinhala. So there's a lot of Viruvan, Hamuda, Piyavara, Nilari, Narakshaka. There was also a lot further down the list, Nirmita. Arakshaka. So those were the kinds of terms that were the most popular with Victory Day Sri Lanka, Victory Day SL. Then we looked at Mulivaikkal. And lo and behold, you find something very different. All of the words, statistically, the most used, the highest frequency are in English, and they talk about something very different. It's completely different. It's remembrance. It's Tamils. It's never forgetting. And you take a look at the emoticons, there's a lot of sadness there. There's a lot of sadness there. And the gratitude that you see here isn't the gratitude that you see in the Victory Day SL. It's a very different kind of gratitude aimed at a very different kind of community and for a very different kind of thing. And if you take a look at something called, what we call hashtag co-occurrence, which is a long-winded way of saying at any one point of time, you can look at Twitter and then see which are the most popular hashtags at that time. So you give one hashtag and you can then ask Twitter to give me all the other hashtags around that hashtag. So you can see, as a consequence of those hashtags, what kinds of things people were talking about. If you looked at Mulik Vaikal, the conversation was fundamentally different. In fact, diametrically opposed to Victory Day. It's extraordinary. Looking at Twitter last year at this time, there are 2 Sri Lankas. And never do the twain meet. There is no connection. 10 years after the end of the war, looking at just the content on this platform, if it is indicative of anything, it is of a country that is inexorably divided. Completely. There's no meeting point at all in the data, in what the sentiment is. So this is what the data tells us, just on Twitter. Around a country so polarized, we can't even come together to kind of agree on a common narrative in order to move forward around what happened 10 years ago. It's extraordinary. And for a research, I can tell you, downright bloody depressing. My doctoral research is an exercise in every day in New Zealand trying to stay away from alcoholism. Because there is really very little that gives you joy in the country that I am studying, at the time that I am studying here. So let's go further. This is either the start of a very good story or a very bad joke. And you have to determine what it is. You know who the priest is. The wife is not his, obviously. Don't tweet that, please. I want to go home tonight. And a policeman. And it's not the Bundy policeman who's giving the pat on the back to the hero here. But what is this about? I mean, this is so interesting. So I took a look at the time that Nyanasara Thero was released from prison. And I looked at Twitter and Facebook at the time. And also at the time, I looked at the kind of content that was directed against another individual who I'll talk about later. But first, around Nyanasara Thero. By the way, all of these snapshots are of tweets, so if you want to actually learn more, it's all in the public domain. I've put this out. So when Nyanasara Thero was released, I mean, you had this what we call an emotional contagion constructed as a consequence of the content that was put out by mainstream media on Facebook, and in particular 3 channels, I won't name which they are. And so you had a lot of framing, a lot of content around the release of the Thero. And just to give you an idea of how much this engaged people, just in that week, the videos that were put out on the Thero were viewed 2.8 million times. To give you an idea, 463 videos from about 30 of the leading civil society institutions I track on Facebook over the past year got just 1.83 million views. So in a week, the Nyanasara Thero's release was more popular than any civil society activism we've done for the past bloody year. So we can all just pack up and go home and then bloody sleep. Because what are we doing? And I'll come back to this later because it's a wake-up call, really, for civil society that I am engaged with, self-critically looking in dealing with this landscape. If you don't wake up and smell the roses, you're already obsolete. You just don't know it. So this is the kind of emotional contagion created on account of the Thero's release, and it's extraordinarily fascinating. Right? It's extraordinarily fascinating. If you take a look at the emotional reactions, because Facebook API gives you this data, a lot of people were expressing love and joy and happiness at his release. And if you take a look at the anger and sadness, it's not statistically significant. And obviously it generates a lot of engagement, a lot of sharing, a lot of liking. In fact, so much so, and this is the problem with Facebook, that Facebook now thinks that this is bloody hell, something really cool. So then it starts algorithmically amplifying it. And so then you see it much more. None of this is boosted content. But then because this is something that is actually being generated, it's what is artificially put up in a sense, now Facebook starts thinking it's popular. And then it starts spreading much more. Extraordinary stuff. You look at Twitter, and this is again now, I want you to recall that kind of oil and water scenario, or the transversal of media. What is happening on Facebook then trickles down into Facebook. What is happening on Facebook trickles down into Twitter. And on Twitter you see the same pattern. Obviously with much lesser volume and engagement, because Twitter is much less in terms of user base than Facebook, but you see the same pyramidical structure of heightened interest and engagement in partial terms to the Thero's release. They dominate the content. And a lot of that content coming out of the private television stations, and as a consequence of all the commentary and engagement, sees the Thero in very complimentary terms. This is an English translation of the substance of the commentary and content and comments that the Thero attracted. At the same time, and this is my truck and beef with Facebook, and I'll come back to that later. At the same time, and this next slide is going to be hard to read, but I want you to, in this next slide, whisper to yourself a word that you see on the screen, and imagine this woman who's at the receiving end of what is a tsunami, unlike anything that you and I in this room have experienced. This woman is Sandhya Naligoda. At the same time, the Thero is being venerated and celebrated. Repeat to yourself silently, if you will, any one of those words or phrases that in good Suddha Sinhala, she is being called on Facebook. This is an English translation of words that sometimes have no translation in English, which in private settings I would say, but in public and polite company I can't. But I think the English gives you a hint. This is not one comment, 10 comments, 100 comments. This is not one page. I literally had to devote my time at the time to capture these comments and send it off to Facebook saying this woman is in imminent harm of something physically and kinetically happening to her and her two sons as a consequence of the hate at the time generated as a consequence of the Thero's release. So you have two different Sri Lankas. Repeat to yourself one of those words. Say it out aloud. Because that is what she faces to this day. And her two sons as well. I then migrated in June, again before the election, to take a look at something very interesting that was happening. As you know, last year we saw an historical development, the Parliamentary Select Committee. First time in our country's history that a PSC has been set up in the manner that it was set up, looking to the 21st of April violence. So then Shanaka Amarasinghe's question on Twitter, not necessarily directed at me, but I took it up because I was interested in the question, asked why the PSC's reportage and the PSC's proceedings weren't given the same prominence that MSM, mainstream media, TV, was given to the Nyanasara Thero. Arguably, the PSC was on something that affected all of us as a country. Extraordinary moment, historical stuff. But Chanaka's point was he wasn't seeing anything. So then I looked into it. Because those like myself and Yuda, we like to kind of see what the data tells us, whether it holds up. And so, when I went into it, you could see that, and I don't want to spend time on the data, the PSC's reportage, the first week of the PSC hearings when the former IGP was saying what he did, I don't know whether you even recall that stuff. The revelations he was making in front of the PSC hearing were getting far less attention than Yamasara. So a proceeding of historic and national importance was being completely marginalized by arbiters of truth and the producers and the framers of content on Facebook simply because they could. So this was all happening at the same time. What happens during elections? And this is why, Prasad, I don't know where you're sitting, I think that the Facebook workshop that some of you may have attended earlier today doesn't really capture the complexity of what's happening on the ground in the country. So when Facebook says they have a committee looking at what's happening in Sri Lanka, I think that's cute. I think that's the story I would tell my son if he was about 10 years younger, where he would hold his teddy bear and probably fall asleep to. We don't have that luxury. And I'll tell you why. This is what's happening right now in our country. This is a page called Bro. When the election campaign was at its peak, in a sense, late October last year, Bro put up this page where it was one of the incumbents' rallies. The incumbent is not in the picture, the incumbent president is not in the picture, but Bro mentions it's a Buddha Peramuna rally. And it's basically around two ostensibly members of the public who are holding an umbrella to two armed guards. Okay, cool. Cool story, bro. So that's Bro. This is NIFM. Same photo. This is 1000 Talk. Same rally, same photo. This is romantic moments. Don't ask me why it's called romantic. Because if you follow the page, there's nothing romantic about it. Much of it is actually political. And I actually was driven to alcoholism around what was on this page during Valentine's Day. But at the time it put up this photo. Manusakam. Right? This is what you call the creation of inauthentic emotional engagement. So 4 pages, very different, no connection. If you take a look at the page admins, they're very different, set up at different times, different years. So why am I showing you these 4? This was put up at 6:14 on October 29. This was put up at 6:14 October 29. This was put up at 6:15 October 29. This was put up at 6:49 October 29. This is not the only example. This is active. There are hundreds of pages in a coordinated manner putting out and promoting content that is partial to, and may I just say for purposes of fairness, not just SLPP, but political framing, political ideology. Ostensibly very different pages, but acting in a in a collaborative manner. These are what I call coordinated, inauthentic content production. Facebook has a name for it. It's just that Facebook cannot identify it because it's happening in Sinhala. And it's algorithmically not geared to what Facebook does with the Russian kind of efforts in the United States that follow the same template. But this is happening right now. This is already in the past. And this is just one example. This is actually quite dangerous. Right? This is sponsored stuff. This is coordinated stuff. That is pushing out a particular political frame, ostensibly through various pages. But that's not the end of it. So during the election time, you also saw this kind of stuff. So you also find constructed realities and projected outcomes during the campaign, by the way, projected outcomes. People prophesizing, not just astrologers, what the outcome is going to be. So while the elections commissioner says you shouldn't conduct mock polls, you could end up in jail, anybody, I mean quite frankly, anybody who's on Facebook would have seen a poll on Facebook. There were thousands of them. And there is, I won't mention the page, but this is just one page. And at the time that I took it, it was about a day after it was put, You can see that it's got around 40,000 votes, 3,000 comments, and about 1,400 shares, and around 2,400 emotional reactions. Right? So this is again emotional contagion. This is Kopitakanta. You're generating artificial strains of conversations and engagements, which the Elections Commission has said, in a sense, is illegal to conduct in any other domain, but is happening apace on Facebook. It's openly happening. And then there are other things that are happening as well. And I bring these up because these are dangerous to kind of consider for the future of our democracy if the topic of the conversation today is an open society. So visibly, this is the easy stuff. All of us know about it, have cribbed about it. I think everybody on Twitter has tweeted about this. That's overtly partisan content. Adderana, Hiru, Maharaja, Swarnamahini, TNL, they all put out, of course with varying degrees, partisan content. I think somebody made the point that television stations have their candidates, but not all candidates have television stations. That's the kind of country we have today. So this is obvious. And we see a lot of the content that is intended for terrestrial broadcast now being digitally edited and time shifted and put onto YouTube and social media platforms. There's increased spending on social media, there is a proliferation of apps, and now instant messaging is becoming a campaign vector. This is stuff that's happening. The stuff that's also happening is that officially what we call the cooling period, the 48 hours before the election day, is an absolute joke. It's farcical. Nothing stops on social media. It continues as it was. And we don't have the legislative architecture, leave aside the technical competence, to oversee this, and in any way, shape or form, manage it. India's election commission does things different. We can talk about that. But in Sri Lanka, in the last presidential election, it was farcical, the so-called polling period, in the digital space, which of course, obviously influences the physical. But these are the darker things that are happening. And again, Prasad, this is why I said that the likes of Natasha Chok really don't understand, or maybe had not wanted to publicly reveal the kind of complexity of things that are happening on Facebook. This is old stuff, right? This is not what is going to happen. It's already happened. And this is also a shade of what I am seeing, because a lot of, and I'll come to that later, a lot of what I am seeing, I can't even actually talk about publicly, because I am scared to talk about it publicly. But in as much as that can be revealed, there is a paper-based economy, meaning a cash economy, based on a digital economy. To put another way, Facebook has an ad archive. And a lot of what's happening actually doesn't even get into the Facebook archive because it's not an ad. So there are things like, if you're a popular page admin, I buy you out to not run the ads of my political opponent. That cash transaction is face-to-face. It's not a digital cash transaction. And there's no data signature because you can't track what is not produced. Then there is money given to distract through entertainment. You dig up some shit and you put it up, and it distracts from an inconvenient political or manifesto issue. Then there is the kind of page-based coordination and collaboration between disparate pages, which again is acting in concert and architected at a very high level. That's hidden coordination and collaboration. Then you have, the point about the Facebook ad archive is that it only archives ads. That's a blind spot. Because in countries like ours, in as much as I could determine for the presidential election last year, there's a hell of a lot of content that goes up as sponsored posts that look as if it's a post, but are actually paid for by a political entity or a politician. So it appears as a post, but that's sponsored content. It's just that you can't track it because you never know who sponsored it. Of course, you can guess, but there's no traceability of that content. And then there is this entire business of influencers, which I'll come to later, which the Federal Trade Commission just last week in the United States has started a process of review, because it's such a problem, because they're worried about the next presidential election over in the US. And then we have what in political science is called a constant campaign over these main platforms. What is a constant campaign? This is a snapshot. And the person from government will forgive me for putting these up. But it's really interesting because it's in the public domain. This is a snapshot of Instagram in the time of the presidential election. And you can see that the one image that is overtly political, if you take a look at the statistics around it, it's dwarfed by the content and commentary around the other photos that are entirely based on family or self, or girlfriend or wife. So it's really fascinating. I would encourage, if any one of you is interested in studying this further and is inspired by my presentation today, to just do, and I mean this without any iota, I mean this in all seriousness, of the SLPP and the Rajapaksa social media production. It is a textbook study of how it's done. Extraordinary stuff. And the highest engagement is around the Rajapaksa wedding. But then I looked at, in August, all of Instagram. And then, if you take a look at Ranil and Sajid and the Rajapaksas, and you take a look at every single Instagram post they put up since the time of their Instagram posts, you have 3 different worlds here. I won't go into too much of detail, but depending on who you follow, again, it will determine how you see the country. And a lot of this I've captured and put out in the public domain as a Google document. There are hundreds of posts, there are hundreds of tweets, thousands of accounts, and millions of data points. The only positive thing, in a sense, that contributed insofar as I can say, that social media contributed to push back against authoritarianism was in the time of the constitutional crisis, late 2018. Every other occasion actually is slightly more different. So what I want to leave you are some thoughts and questions, and these are stuff for our discussion today. What is the nature of power on social media? So on academics call this 99-1 principle. A few powerful institutions or actors create the most amount of content on social media. And whereas when I think at the time that I started blogging, when Indy started Kottu, it was very different. The state, the government, the traditional broadcasters, the power brokers of the day were not on social media. And so this was a way in which citizen voices were heard. But today there is almost a total capture of social media by the powerful, by the state, by the government, by the traditional broadcasters. Those who have had voice historically are now the ones with the greatest voice on social media. So that's a bit of a shift. Not a bit of a shift, that's actually quite an interesting one. Then you have, I think that the 3 channels are really interesting. What the hell do you do with them if you're Facebook? So on the one hand, Facebook wants to stop disinformation. On the other hand, they have a whole lot of corporate initiatives to engage with these kinds of broadcasters to increase and enhance their content reach and production. So for a company like Facebook, the left hand is incompatible with what the right hand is doing. These broadcasters, as you know, and I don't have to say, are for me indistinguishable from political parties, because they have all chosen to align themselves with the political ideology. So what do you then do with the kinds of platforms we have today that algorithmically generate much more attention and engagement around the worst kind of content that people should be engaging with, and all the problems that accrue as a consequence? So I call this a kind of like a digital Stockholm syndrome. Rohan has been checking his phone throughout, and many of you have been as well. We seem to be, whether it's dopamine in our brains, or muscle memory, or agitation, or withdrawal symptoms, we are addicted to this damn thing. And that is if you take a look at some of the content and books coming out by literally the engineers who created this addiction, those engineers are hypocritically, for me, now trying to write books to get us away from the addiction. I'm not making this up. I'm literally not making this up. So they are the same people now writing NYT bestsellers to get us away from the addiction, because they know better than we do how much they have engineered into these platforms and apps, the ways through which, the mirrored ways through which they keep us hooked. And the hooked is to toxicity. Keep us hooked is to the worst of the content that we can imagine. And I'm sorry, but Facebook fuels flames that fuel Facebook. It's a profit model that for me is incompatible with all the highfalutin things the platform says it wants to do with curtailing this content. It's obvious. It just doesn't gel, it doesn't connect. Everything that I see on Facebook is not a consequence just in terms of the platform, but it's exacerbated by the way the platform conducts itself and the way the algorithms are set up. So the good people that we engage and know and love within the company are marginalized within the company itself because senior management and marketing just don't talk to them. So what they do is not within the company itself congruent with what marketing wants to do and wants the company to become. So this is out of last week, where Facebook says that in the States and globally, influencer posts will not be checked for veracity unless they actually quote a politician. This is a problem with the likes of Iraj, for example, in this country. I'm not putting up the data, but with the incumbent's electoral campaign on Facebook, Iraj was statistically significant. Statistically significant. I won't say more. So one individual with 2 pages was statistically significant in the incumbent's electoral campaign, which gives you an idea of how much of content was produced and how much it was engaged with. So if Facebook is saying that this kind of content is not going to be addressed, and if influencers are going to be allowed to do this kind of thing at scale and at broader speed and scope, we have a problem. And then we have Rohit Chopra, who's the FTC head, who says that he's going to launch something of a review because influencers are a problem in the United States and they're a problem here too. So when are we going to launch a review of the influencer culture and its intersection with politics in our country? And to end with, in a sense, this is a page, a screenshot of the page, the Ground Views page, how it looked like 13 years ago. Ground Views was the first media page in the country to get on Facebook, followed shortly after by a Twitter account. Collectively, they were the first on Facebook and Twitter. This is what it looked like. And then Facebook was a space and a page where we fought against government and the meta-narrative and the majoritarian perspectives. Now, it's no longer the case. That has been grasped by state actors and government and proxy actors aligned to the government or the state who are far better able to do that than civil society. But I also don't want to leave you with the kind of belief that this is all a technological problem. Have we in Sri Lanka ever had an open society? This is what I grew up with and I went home as a consequence of in July 1983. Those of a certain age will remember July. I remember July. I remember the smell of it. I can't remember the faces. I remember the smell. I remember the burning. I have vivid memories of people in vehicles, even though I don't see them as people. And my parents tell me I didn't sleep for a good year because I used to wet my bed. Clearly, I was so traumatized by what I saw. I couldn't process it. And the first I was able to write about it was in fact about 4 or 5 years ago when I wrote a Facebook note called The Woman in the Red Pottu about my first memories of a woman who died in July. So, have we ever had an open society? What about the Muslim riots? Is this society open? And are we just projecting onto technology today what is a country that has never had in the way that Dean talked about it, in the Popper model, or the Periclean model, or the George Soros model, an open society? Because of the algorithms today that are, in a sense, exacerbating subjective bias, and also because in as much as we celebrate the likes of Devyani, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, the wildlife officer who was a viral phenomenon on Facebook, it's episodic. And now it's actually quite dangerous about the woman, as Amantha Pereira tweeted today, because now it's actually journalists going and interviewing her. And without any regard for her personal safety and security, moving on, because we know that the state has a long arm and a long memory. So whenever there is something celebratory on social media, including the 2 most popular tweets after Easter Sunday, was about a blood-stained Jesus with a biblical chapter and verse espousing non-violence. And the second most, in the 24 hours, most popular tweet after Easter Sunday was an image of the blood bank with visibly Muslim individuals, foreigners and others, giving blood. Those are the 2 tweets that were the most popular in the 24 hours after the 21st attack. these are still episodic moments. What is normal, what is normalized, what is the more prevalent is far more disturbing stuff, where citizenship has moved from active agentive citizenship to a like or a share or a pithy comment, and we think, all right, that's done, that's it, that's what we need to do. We can go to sleep safe and secure in the knowledge that we have liked something that is going to encourage democratic change. And that is all that we need to do. So, 2 final slides. There's a really interesting German theorist called Michael Bodman, who writes about something called theaters of memory. And theaters of memory, actually, most of his academic writing is pegged to the pogrom in 1938 in November, where thousands of Jews were killed around one night while German soldiers looked on. Starkly and strangely reminiscent of what happened in Black July. And this theory is really interesting because if you take a look at his writing, he talks about how technology is creating new memories, refashioning, reimagining memory. And if you take a look at social media today in the way that I look at it, over Twitter and Facebook in particular, it's reimagining things from our past. It's reimagining 1983 as it didn't happen. In ways it didn't happen. It's reimagining 2009 and 2010 and 2015 and all the other historical moments as if they didn't happen or in very different ways to how they happened. So it's a very interesting way in the long-term construction of memory and mindset through the kind of content at scale that you're seeing on social media. And finally, if you take a look at the blurb, I'm scared to talk about this. This is an iota of what I see. I have directly and explicitly told certain people in government that I will not be publishing because I don't want to be a target. And so for the academic researcher who is also a citizen of this country, yes, it is a position of extreme privilege to be able to see this happening in real time and to project into the future what it portends. But I'm also really lonely and isolated because who do I say? Who do I talk this about? What more can I see and what more should I be saying? And if I should be saying that and then producing that or publishing that, what is the line in the sand that I cross? That when somebody sees it, says that Sanjana Hattotuwa knows too much or sees too much or has said too much, and if he's not with us, then we shouldn't allow him to be with somebody else. These are challenges for the kind of research that I do and the kind of researchers that are around the world dealing with this kind of context that are very real. So that's why I also said in the blurb, it's difficult to talk about these things in the political context that we live in. I'm genuinely worried about this. And so I don't put out a lot that I see simply because I don't want to be more of a target than I may already be, but I don't think I am, but I don't want to be one either. So that's just some thoughts that I left you with. And I wonder, I love this meme. It came out during the end of the constitutional crisis, where a lot of the memes, interestingly, were very, very partial to Mahinda and Ranil and entirely against Sirisena. Really interesting in terms of the study of the memes in that time as well. And I have thousands, how that changed, how Sirisena became isolated, and how Mahinda and Ranil became joined together in laughing at Sirisena. And I wonder whether to kind of brutalize Shakespeare, whether in all of what we say is wrong with social media, and I actually am very, very partial to this. I would like to project to you that what we are in our own accounts and in our own digital lives, it's what the algorithms pick up on. And I have no great hope. In fact, I don't think the social media companies are interested in changing all that much. So what are we left with? We are left with a reflection of how we engage with each other and what we are in our digital personas on social media. And if we are conscious and able to critically understand that what we say matters. During my field work, for example, in this past 5 months, I have been talking with individuals who are now in their 30s, but tell me that their political imagination was shaped as a consequence of ground views 15 years ago, which of course makes me feel very old. But I also am very saddened to hear that, because that should be coming from university or school or parents or peers. That should be coming from ground views. But if we are able to take social media today as influence engines where all of us have a constellation of influence, it does matter how we are online. It does matter how we engage. And that is why I am now far more conscious as a consequence of my doctoral research to be, in a sense, the guardian for the change one wants to see. Thank you very much.